Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Institutionalization of Social Assistance in Africa web seminar. We is moving on in this series of web seminars with many participants, distinguished panelists here. We have Valentina Barca, an international consultant, Stephen Devereaux from IDS, and Jane Marie Ong'olo, from South Africa. She is the head of the Division of Social Welfare, Vulnerable Groups, and Drug Control. We will cover in this session part of a report produced by UNDP, launched last year, that informed the stage of social assistance in Africa, covering all countries. So now, we will start immediately with the presentation of Valentina Barca. Welcome, Valentina. You have the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So if you hand over the control to me, perfect. Start. Can everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen? Well, I'll assume you can see it. So as Romulo said, we're focusing on this institutionalizing social assistance in Africa chapter of the report. This is kind of very much pre-COVID work, and it builds on a chapter that I have written with Luis Frodan with extensive inputs from the Transform Master Trainer team, with special thanks to Mavuto Rablo, Gerald Bazo, Stanfield Michello, and Flora Miamba for extensive inputs into this chapter. So institutionalization, it's quite a big mouthful of a word. What do we mean in practice? We're talking about strengthened institutions and capacity, and this was recognized for the first time as a global goal in its own right, not just as a means to attain other goals within SDG 16. And I have some examples here, and there's some useful write-up on this by Christina Berendt and others. So in practice, what are we talking about when we refer to this within the realm of social assistance specifically and for Africa? Of course, this will vary from country to country, but broadly it does include a few pillars, and it's about long-term strategies, policies, and vision that are embedded in legislation. And the legislation part of this has already been covered in another webinar in this series for the UNDP report. It's about predictable national funding to back this, and this has also been covered in another webinar for this, the launch of this report. But it's also about stable government structures with clear roles and responsibilities, and kind of able to support that institutional coordination to bring that vision to life. It's about well allocated and organized adequate human resources and capacity, and a sort of bedrock of solid, locally relevant rules, processes, and delivery systems that are widely understood and accountable. And this, the way this is organized is very much building on some of the literature on this coming also from Latin America, for example. And we're going to be touching on each of these bits over the course of this presentation. But what I wanted to say to start with is, why is this so important? Because on one side, where we see these higher levels of institutionalization, we've got an anchor. We've got something that guarantees policy consistency over time, both kind of within one government, but also across maybe governments of different political beliefs. Kind of, it can help to anchor, and it can set building blocks that we can slowly layer on top of to be ultimately kind of building towards that progressive realization of social protection that we aspire to, that can also adapt in the face of shocks, as we're now seeing with COVID, and Stephen will be talking about this. So starting with the first pillar I'm talking about, this strategy, policy, and legislation, which I won't touch on. So what we're talking about here is having a document somewhere where a coalition of people have come together in a participatory way to determine an overarching vision according to national priorities, to define kind of the objectives and functions of social assistance programs, how they work together, how they coordinate. I don't know if someone has to switch their microphone off, sorry. So what we've seen across the region is this process has definitely not been linear. And there's been a bit of a chicken and egg situation by which in many countries we've seen kind of the institutionalizing of programs kind of slowly reaching higher scale and traction even before the formalization into policy and strategy. And we've seen a rapid increase now in policies and strategies in the region with a recent acceleration. And the process to get there has never been straightforward. These have been long and sustained efforts and very much building off sort of coalitions of different actors across civil society, development partners, parliamentary forums, pushing and sort of taking advantage of policy spaces to be able to make big step forwards. And definitely no template in terms of what we see within those strategies. If we go to the next slide, you can find a lot more details within the report itself. I'm now not doing justice to the depth of content. So if we see across the region, this is just to give you a sort of flash example of the countries where we do have a strategy and policy for specifically for social protection in place. Here I've colored in Somalia as sort of the 17th September 2019 was the launch of their strategy. There's some countries which you might see not marked here for some reason. Sometimes it's because the vision for social protection is not necessarily embedded in a specific social protection policy, but elsewhere. These two visuals very quickly that you can take a better look at within the report just show you how this growth of specific programs in the region kind of over time preceded the growth of the actual kind of writing up and formulation and that participatory process of agreeing on what a national social protection policy or strategy could look like. If you go and look on the UNDP kind of repository of information, you can actually click and find these strategies to have a kind of comparative look at across countries. Another interesting thing I just wanted to stress, and here, forget about the detail in this visual, but just look at sort of these turning points. Sometimes we see a program, these are programs and the number of beneficiaries, individuals that they're reaching over time. And we see turning points that are sometimes linked to policy shifts, but very often they're linked to crises as opportunity, and that role of civil society just kind of jumping on policy spaces that open up, sometimes using evidence in very useful ways to be pushing a discourse of institutionalizing social assistance. And there's some useful references on this down below. So B, we're coming to the institutional coordination aspect, and we can think of this at a policy level, so horizontal coordination at a policy level or at an administrative level across programs. And this is really about, is there an authority, a coordinating body to hold line ministry and other actors to account against the achievement of that common objective of that vision in terms of policy, but also drive that vision practically in terms of the range of programs that are working together to achieve that vision. So, for example, at policy level, we look at some objective indicators. So when was that coordinating body, when was that maybe ministry created to oversee the functions of social protection? How high is it in the government hierarchy? Does it have a kind of, is it dedicated? Does it have a full-blown mandate to be performing that function? Is there interministerial coordination? Is there some body steering group that has that function? And how is that operationalized? And what we're subjectively trying to grasp, if you look here on the right, is ultimately what level of convening power you have in that country, what level of decision-making authority and ability to gain traction from other government organs to be able to push that agenda, because we know that traditionally social welfare ministries often don't sit very high up in a government hierarchy. And from a program perspective, there's objective questions around whether there's a single executing agency that's responsible for actually implementing maybe several programs, not just one program, and integrated administrative tools and systems such as an information system that works across several programs potentially, or an M&E system that looks overarching across the sector. And again, what we're trying to grasp subjectively is to what extent does the government have the ability to operationalize that vision. Now, again, the details you can find in the report and also in the annexes. So on the policy supervision, we see a very fast and swift increasing trend in this direction of having a mandated ministry or often a sort of coordinating bodies to drive the social protection agenda. These are organized very differently. There's no recipe. Each has pros and cons. And also who is involved within that kind of spectrum of actors varies widely. And one example which is relevant now for COVID and for other shocks is that very often in that coordination, there are emergency actors, disaster risk management actors, development partners working on emergency humanitarians don't appear. From a cross-sectoral administration, so actually making kind of the programs work, so there's few with a sort of single executing agency and ministry, but that has also been increasing. And there's been a definite move in recent years away from a sort of nested separate program management unit. So just that pilot approach by which one program does things on its own, but doesn't really coordinate with the rest of government. And that's slowly being overcome across the continent. And an increasing trend towards integrated information systems to be just managing information across those range of programs. And these are operationalized in very different ways across countries with implications for what they can do and cannot do. This is a sort of an aspect C on organizational structure and capacity that to me comes kind of very much at heart. And let's start from the vertical coordination dimension. So vertical coordination, how do higher tiers of government coordinate down to local levels of implementation? Because ultimately, local government, decentralized administrative units are the eyes and ears of your program. They're the hands of your program. They're the ones who actually implement in practice. And what we see in quite a few countries in the region is sort of responsibility is shifted downwards in terms of decentralization, but without adequate reallocation of financial and human resources, or a sort of maybe a flow of information that is just flowing upwards but not down again, and the decision making very much centralized at the top. And that's what you can see in this picture, where we've got quite high levels of centralization overall. This comes again from the UNDP data that accompanies this report. There's sort of some complexity in countries where maybe there's no direct executing or line ministry. So you've got, in Mozambique, for example, you have INASH as an executing agency and the Ministry of Gender and Social Action as a line ministry. And at local level, those lines of accountability become much more complex and sort of affecting outcomes. Of course, there's lots of great examples of institution building at local level, taking this seriously. And maybe Ethiopia is a nice one to see how every administrative level has allocated, dedicated capacity. Now, the second half of this bucket is about the core capacity, and ultimately, how can we be aspiring to move towards more inclusive on-demand registration, for example, or a more nuanced approach to case management where we're linking different programs across if we don't have that capacity at local level of implementation. And you can see here just that the sheer numbers kind of in South Africa is performing much better than others in the region, 16.3 social workers per 100,000 inhabitants. Here, kind of less than around 20% of program participants have access to a social worker in 2015. And here, this here is looking at offices at local levels of implementation. So in Mozambique, for example, you have 30 social welfare offices serving a very large population, i.e. one office for every 989,000 people living in that area. And what this means is in a lot of countries, we have over-reliance on volunteer structures and deprioritization of some of those fundamental functions that social workers can be playing. Or very often, these people are capacity at local level, but they're not trained social workers. They don't do social worker functions. They just broadly end up being administrators of cash, which is a problem because we know that that's not sufficient. So those are not the only capacity problems. There's also competency issues, sort of people maybe being political appointees and not having the right capacities to be performing their jobs. Big turnover problems, recruitment problems due to freezes, when capacity assessments in several countries are really bringing out some of these issues. Lack of processes and procedures, but increasingly kind of awareness that operational manuals and some of the way that regulations trickle down to local level needs to be different. A law is not sufficient to be driving operations at local level. and a serious lack of material resources sort of affecting people's capacity to actually perform their jobs. So not having a vehicle, not having fuel or maintenance costs covered. Coming to the last bucket on sort of the rules, the processes, the delivery systems, we've seen some incredible progress just in recent years in terms of how delivery systems and delivery of social protection has been adapted to domestic contexts, really kind of changing so taking maybe lessons from other countries, but realizing that a lot of them are not relevant because of a particular situation in country. And so what we're seeing in terms of registration is many countries not able to perform on-demand registration because of lack of capacity at local level, but experimenting with more active outreach approaches, an increasing traction of digital solutions to the registration enrollment issue. We're seeing in terms of targeting a lot of kind of innovative ways in which this is being done, hybrid approaches, kind of layering different approaches to targeting, including a strong focus on community participation in a lot of countries. And on the payment side, we've seen a great wave of innovation and sort of leapfrog technology being leveraged for payments. Of course, not the majority is still not at that stage, but a lot of experimentation, pilot programs that are sort of leveraging mobile money and other approaches. And I really highly recommend a paper by a colleague, Lena Grombach, that is sort of an even updated compared to this report, looking at social cash transfer payment systems in sub-Saharan Africa. So just to conclude, what does this mean for COVID? So this webinar, I accepted to be part of this pre-COVID, but ultimately we've been repeating with COVID that what you can do in this response depends on what you have broadly, and it's about the data, the capacity, the systems that you can be leveraging in this response. And so everything we've been talking about, they're that anchor, they're those building blocks that we can be using in this response. There's a few more resources here, and I'm going to hand over to Stephen to actually start zoning into what we've actually seen with the COVID response. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina. I'd like to thank you especially for your amazing command of the time. So we had the opportunity to hear Valentina Barca. She is an international consultant from social protection, and she has worked across over 15 countries in Asia, South America, and Africa. So now I'd like to invite Stephen Denvero from South Africa. Stephen has worked many years in Brighton, the University of Sussex, and now he's based in the University of Western Cape in South Africa. Stephen is a renowned specialist on social protection, and I'd like to invite Stephen. But before that, I'd like to remind all of you who are participating in this session that you can address questions to the participants using the platform. So please send your questions. Stephen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Romulo, and thank you, Valentina, for your presentation. The report that Valentina was talking to was published last year, and since then, of course, we've been affected heavily by COVID. So what I'm going to talk about is how institutional responses to COVID-19 have reflected some of the changes that Valentina has been describing, some of the progress that we've seen in institutional response mechanisms. I'm assuming you can see my screen. So I'm going to look at 3 case studies from Africa.
Not yet. Wait a minute, please.
Hello?
Yeah, wait a minute, because we are about to share your slides.
Can you see my screen?
No.
Okay.
So while Stephen is now it's yes, now you have. Please go ahead.
Okay, you can see it now. Good. So I'm going to look at 3 case studies of country responses to COVID-19, social assistance responses. And I'm going to look at Ethiopia first and how they've applied shock responsive solutions by building on existing social protection institutions, programs, and platforms. Then I'll look at South Africa, which demonstrates both the strength of using existing institutional mechanisms and the challenges of introducing new programs during a crisis. And I'll close by looking at Botswana, which has actually leveraged this increasing focus on social protection triggered by COVID-19 to build back better in terms of strengthening their national social protection system. But first, let's just look briefly at where we are in terms of COVID-19 in Africa. At first, it seemed that the pandemic, was going to be concentrated mainly in Europe, in Western European countries, and then the USA, now increasingly in Latin America as well. But it seemed that Africa might escape the worst of the problem and that it might almost pass Africa by, more or less. But this now doesn't seem to be the case. The numbers are rising fast. Here in South Africa, we've just passed 200,000 cases. As you can see from that graph from World Health Organization, the surge is definitely happening and probably likely to increase in the coming months. So it's a real challenge. It's not something which is missing Africa at all. But I think it's important when we talk about social assistance to look at what actually are we talking about. And it's not the health crisis so much. That obviously is a major part of it, and there is a public health response to that. It's more the lockdowns that have been imposed in response to the health crisis, which have created the problems that social assistance has responded to. So the lockdowns have been associated with lack of business activity, with prohibitions on movement and so on. And that's created an economic crisis. So many countries are heading towards a major recession. And in the meantime, people are sitting at home unemployed. Many people can't work at home. They're earning nothing and they don't have access to social protection, especially low-income people. And so they are the ones that need some kind of humanitarian or social protection support. So it's the health crisis which led to the lockdown, which in turn triggered an economic crisis, which has produced the social crisis of unemployment, food insecurity, and poverty, to which social protection has to respond. So let's start by looking at how Ethiopia has responded. And I'm being very selective here because there's a lot to talk about, but I only have 15 minutes. So I'll talk about a particular aspect of the response. In Ethiopia, the major flagship social protection program is called the Productive Safety Net Program, the PSNP. It's been going for about 15 years. It reaches 8 million people in rural areas, and it provides direct support in the form of cash transfers or food transfers to people that can't work. And public works, short-term employment on community infrastructure projects for people who can work. So there's a picture on the right of a public works project which shows you the kind of work that they do. But under the lockdowns, public works activities were all stopped. So there are no more public works projects happening in Ethiopia at the moment because of the social distancing and so on. But what they did is that they continued to pay people on those programs anyway. So they used the fact that there was already a caseload of people that were needing social assistance, that were getting it through established targeting, registration, and payment mechanisms, just to continue paying them anyway. And this practice has been followed in other countries as well. So Botswana has a program called Ipelecheng, which is also public works. They also stopped their activities, but continued paying people. South Africa has what they call the Expanded Public Works Program. Similarly, projects have stopped, but people are still being paid. And in a way, this is very similar to the big program in the UK called the furlough scheme, where the government is actually paying employers to pay their workers up to 80% of their salary to keep them at home during the lockdown rather than make them unemployed. So these are all mechanisms to protect people's incomes, even though they are not working at the moment. Another program in Ethiopia, which is the Urban Safety Net Program, has responded similarly, or in a slightly different way, to the COVID-19 crisis. It's a smaller program than the rural one. It only reaches 600,000 people, and it's relatively new. But what they did is what we call a shock responsive vertical expansion of the program. A vertical expansion means you increase the benefits to existing beneficiaries. This is another institutional response would be to increase the number of people on the existing program, which is a horizontal expansion. So what they've done is they've given a cash top-up to all the people on the Urban Productive Safety Net Program who are direct support beneficiaries. They've given them enough money to buy food for themselves, plus soap and hand sanitizer to stay safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a classic shock response mechanism because they use the existing payment mechanisms to pay people into their bank accounts. It's a rapid response because all you have to do is make a policy decision to increase the payments. It doesn't require any additional institutional mechanisms. It's convenient because the beneficiaries collect the money as before, and they were doing as before the crisis. No new systems are required, and there's no queuing required, so it complies with social distancing. So these are two shock response mechanisms which are very quick and simple and effective to implement during a crisis like COVID-19. Let's come to South Africa. Now, South Africa, they have done many things, and one of the things they did is set up a new grant called the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant. It is open to anybody who is unemployed, not earning any income, or not receiving a social grant, and not accessing any unemployment insurance. So the amount was pretty small. It was about $20 a month for 6 months, which is below the food poverty line. But nonetheless, it attracted a lot of interest, and many people actually needed that money very badly. The application process was designed to be simple, so nobody had to go to an office or fill out a form. It was only done electronically. You applied by WhatsApp or over the phone or by email, and it was supposed to be quick and easy. And you'd register for the program, and it would be paid into your bank account. So here on the right, you see a page from the website which tells you how to apply, who's eligible, and so on. The problem was that you're setting up a new program in the middle of a crisis, which requires a very rapid response. And this actually created a major challenge, specifically around processing delays. So initially, when the program was announced on 21st of April, it was estimated that between 10 and 15 million people were eligible. There were 13 million people that inquired about it. 5 million actually applied. But a month later, they'd started processing 2.6 million of those applications. They were about to pay 11,000 people, and they'd only paid actually 9. So basically, they hadn't got the program off the ground after the first month. And that was very serious because, you know, these people needed money very urgently. They'd suddenly lost their livelihoods, especially urban informal workers, traders, and so on, who were sitting at home with no income at all, and they needed this money. So the fact that it was slow to get off the ground was very challenging. And the reason was simply that it took a long time to verify all those applications, and they still have a backlog. They're now paid about 3 million people, but the backlog is still there. And initially, there were so many applications and inquiries that they actually crashed the platform altogether. So WhatsApp actually froze for a while. So that's a problem with starting a new program. Much more effective is to work with an existing program. So what they also did in South Africa is that they used the social grant system to top up people's money, to give them extra cash. So in April, the child support grant, which is a major program that reaches 12 million children in South Africa, was almost doubled. The amount was almost doubled for the next 6 months until October. And as I said, a large proportion of those that are badly affected are people that are working in low-income activities who lost their income and can't work from home. So some academics have done some research into looking at whether increasing a social grant that targets children was effective in terms of reaching those informal workers. In other words, looking at their households. And the answer is yes, it was effective. Firstly, it was a rapid shock response mechanism. So it used the existing registration and payment mechanisms of the child support grant to reach those people that it was trying to reach without having to set up complex new programs. And secondly, it's well targeted at poor households. So if you look at this diagram on the right, all the households on the left that are pink, the pink bars show you the households that are receiving the child support grant. So you can see that the poorest households on the left get much more likely to receive the child support grant than the richer households on the right. So it's fairly well targeted at the poor. Secondly, the green bars show you those households which have both an informal worker and a child support grant recipient. So if you're trying to reach informal workers, then the child support grant actually does reach most of those households that have informal workers in them, especially in the lower income deciles. And thirdly, the blue at the bottom are those households which have informal workers but no child support grant. So you can see that the blue bar is much shorter than the green bars, meaning that the number of informal workers excluded from this top up of the child support grant is very low. That doesn't mean you don't also need some kind of support for those people that are left out, but it does mean that using an existing mechanism is very quick and can reach most of those people that are badly affected by loss of livelihoods during the pandemic. Let me move on to my third case study now, which is Botswana, and here I'm looking much more at the system level rather than just an individual program. So the pandemic has prompted a review of the entire system in Botswana, which hasn't really been looked at in detail for quite a long time. And they commissioned what they called the National Social Protection Recovery Plan. And that looks not only at programs, but also at mechanisms, systems, and institutions that deliver social assistance and social protection in Botswana. So here's a timeline of the main programs, social assistance programs in Botswana. As you can see, they've been spread out over a long period. Many were set up around independence in 1966. That's the Vulnerable Group Feeding Program, School Feeding, Rural Areas Development Program, and so on. And then later on, there were Ipelecheng, which is the Public Works Program, Destitute Persons Program, set up around the drought of the mid-80s. Later on, HIV and AIDS came along, and some programs like the pension and community home-based care were set up, and orphan care was set up around AIDS. And then very little, in fact, no new programs for about 20 years until COVID came along and prompted the introduction of a food relief program. So what we see from this is that programs were often set up in response to specific shocks, but they're not very coordinated. They don't deliver a comprehensive protection through the life cycle. They are responding to specific shocks. So the first thing that has been proposed is to try to harmonize those social protection programs around the life course. So you have comprehensive coverage from birth to death, or from pregnant women and infants up to the elderly or older persons. So there should be support provided at all stages of the life course. And cross-cutting that would be, for example, a disability grant, taking note of the fact that disability affects all age cohorts. So that was the first set of proposals. The second was to try to unify the system of a life course approach to social grants or social protection by putting in place mechanisms like a single registry, a common delivery system, a grievance procedure for people to complain if they're left out or not receiving their payments, and so on. Common communication strategy, a single management information system, and then monitoring and evaluation to be done of these programs on a regular basis, because many of them have never had an evaluation, in fact. So the single registry idea is really important, and it's discussed in the report. It's about linking beneficiaries to the common database. So you have all the economic empowerment programs, informal sector and formal sector programs, as well as the social assistance grants and OMANG, which is the national identity document, all in a single database, so we can see who is getting what and who's being left out, and making sure that there is accurate payment of the right people with the right grants at the right time. So this is the idea about having a common institutional framework for all of these programs, which at the moment is lacking, not just in Botswana, but in many countries. And then finally, we're proposing that there would be a temporary social support grant, which would be kind of similar to a contingency fund or a shock responsive capability, so that programs can expand and contract in response to specific shocks like COVID-19 or anything else like a drought that might happen in the future. And that would provide the basis of a comprehensive and well-coordinated institutional framework for social assistance in Botswana. And finally, there would be a need for looking at institutions in terms of legislative framework. And here we're talking about having laws that would actually give people the right to claim their entitlements from the state. Social protection in Botswana, as in many other countries, is not rights-based at the moment. So we're proposing that there should be laws passed that would give people the mechanism to claim their rights as they are entitled to. Second point, which Valentina also talked about, is to delegate or decentralize subsidiarity to the lowest administrative level, meaning that people on the ground, as Valentina called them, the hands of the program, actually have authority and responsibility over the program at the local level. And finally, the proposal was to set up 2 new institutions to coordinate and deliver social protection. The first would be a Ministry of Social Development, which manages all social protection grants, social security and labor programs, and other functions of social development. And there would also be a Botswana Social Benefits Agency, which has national responsibility for all transfers of cash and food, including procurement and distribution of food to schools and clinics. So to summarize, in Botswana, Ethiopia, and South Africa, we've seen an array of responses. We've seen new institutions being set up, we've seen adapted institutions, and we've seen existing institutions being used to deliver support. And in general, looking across these different mechanisms, The ones that have been set up purely in response to COVID-19 have been fairly slow and complex and difficult to manage. And many times there have been issues around mismanagement and occasionally also corruption. Using existing institutions has worked well when you either adapt an existing institution, but even better when you simply build onto it with a cash transfer top-up, for example. So for example, instance, in the case of Botswana, what I didn't mention is the school feeding at home program. Obviously, when schools were closed, children lost their school meals. So what happened is dry rations or food parcels were delivered to their homes so that they still had some access to food and their families had access to food, even though they'd lost their access to school feeding for the duration of the lockdown. So the lesson here is try to build on existing systems and institutions. Don't try to set up new ones in the middle of a crisis. Conclusion. Immediate response. Well, use existing mechanisms wherever possible. And if you have to set up new ones, try and make them as easy and transparent and accessible as you can. Nobody should lose any social protection benefits because of a shock like COVID-19. And that's been practiced in the sense that public works participants have still been paid in all the 3 countries that I've looked at, even though they're not working during the lockdown. And in the longer term, learning for the future, some lessons here: leverage the fiscal space, the policy window, and the social solidarity that's been generated by COVID-19 to strengthen social protection systems in a number of ways. Firstly, build in shock responsive capacity so that in future you're able to respond quickly and efficiently to a shock. And that can be done also by digitizing social protection processes. In other words, moving from food to cash transfers wherever possible, using electronic payments rather than manual, and having a single registry that harmonizes all the data that you need about your beneficiaries in a single database. And finally, try to strengthen resilience, not only of households and communities against future shocks, but also to make sure that social protection systems themselves can cope with the pressures of a shock that a shock imposes on them. So those are some of the lessons that come out of this very quick review of the initial responses to COVID-19. I'm sure many more will follow as we learn more about the pandemic and the responses that have been adopted across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So we heard Stephen Dembro, and now Stephen is currently MacArthur Fellow at the University of Bremen. So now, after Stephen, and it was an amazing combination because we had the first presentation from Valentina, who covered the report in the state of the art of social assistance in Africa, and now Stephen covering much more the context of three cases in Africa related to COVID-19 response. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Jane Marie Ong'olo from Kenya, and she's from African Union. And as I mentioned before, she's the head of Division of Social Welfare, Vulnerable Groups, and Drug Control. Dr. Jane, so you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Romolo. And I would like to thank Stephen and Valentina also for their presentations. Indeed, now we are moving from the specifics to more general and broad policy frameworks for social protection in Africa as formulated, implemented, and promoted by the African Union Commission. I'll talk more in relation to the role of the African Union Commission in developing and promoting social protection policies in Africa. And if the slide can be moving. Yes, so mainly I'll provide reflections based on the experience of the African Union Commission. Next. I think you've moved 2 slides ahead. If you can go back, please. Next. I think there's a slide you're missing, but nevertheless, it's okay. So the African Union Commission, as we all know, its key role is to accelerate political and socio-economic integration of the continent, which it does mainly through facilitation of development of policies. And one such area is in the social policy arena, looking at programs and policies to tackle poverty and inequality, discrimination, and inclusion, looking mainly at vulnerable groups such as children, women, older persons, persons with disabilities, migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, informal workers, etc. Using inbuilt accountability mechanisms. The main accountability mechanisms are two. There's what we called the sectoral specialized technical committee meetings, which are ministerial meetings taking place every 2 years, and the biannual summits of heads of states. So during the sectoral meetings, the ministers oversee the development and implementation of such policies. And in this sector, we are talking of the sectoral meeting known as Social Development, Labor and Employment, which meets every 2 years to look at these policies. Now, the social protection agenda gained traction, especially when the Ouagadougou Declaration was made in 2004 on employment and poverty alleviation in Africa, which has led to several policy instruments such as the Social Protection Plan for the Informal Economy and Rural Workers. But it received a stronger voice with the AU Continental Framework, Agenda 2063, which we all know about, for the transformation of the continent. But social protection is further contained in a very specific and separate legal instrument, which is the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security. Next. It seems like the slides are mixed up. It's different from, the slides are different from what I shared. So similarly, as I mentioned that the social protection is contained in a very specific legal instrument, that is the Social Protection Protocol. But also there are similar protocols such as the rights of older persons in Africa and the Protocol on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which respectively contains articles dedicated to social protection. Next. So social protection is also elaborated as a very separate social policy pillar in what is known as the AU Social Agenda 2063, which was adopted in February 2020. It directs the social development pathway for achieving Agenda 2063. So having briefly mentioned the broader framework of the social protection, we really do think that an inclusive social protection will be very critical under COVID-19 to address the socio-economic impacts that the pandemic will have and will continue to have. So just quickly, Stephen already mentioned some of the impacts of COVID-19, but just to quickly highlight what AU has put in place are the following, and I'll just mention about 2 or 3. There's a task force headed by the Bureau of the Heads of States at the Heads of State level. There's the COVID Response Fund, but significantly the last one there, the development and coordination of the AU comprehensive response to mitigate the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. And this document has been developed based on the Social Agenda 2063 social pillars. Next. So we can see that there's clear commitment and goodwill to social protection. And from what the previous colleagues have mentioned, there's definitely increased domestic resources for social protection to provide assistance programs to the poor and vulnerable citizens. So I will therefore again enumerate the policies, the continental policies that contain provisions of for social protection. The Agenda 2063, adopted in 2015, it recognizes social protection as both an economic and a social necessity, capable of promoting inclusive, people-driven, and sustainable economic growth. Subsequently, early this year, the Social Agenda 2063 was adopted by the heads of states, and this document provides guidance to member states on social development investments required to build their human capital to achieve Agenda 2063. Next. Next, please. So the Social Agenda 2063 has been in the preparation stage for the last 4 years. So therefore, its landmark adoption in February of this year and the drafting of the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security has now embedded social protection as a human rights issue, at least from the continental policy perspective. The Social Agenda 2063, which is a very important document I would encourage all of us to have a look at, has 9 pillars. The first 2 pillars relate to family policy and gender equality, and these are normally cross-cutting policy pillars in African social policy. But the remaining 7 are very, very key to social protection. They deliberately prompt planning and surgical interventions needed to accelerate the eradication of poverty and inequality. And there are the following, which include social protection as a standalone pillar. So it's social protection, universal access to basic amenities and societal services, quality education, access to good health and wellness, access to sufficient and nutritious food, labor markets and entrepreneurship, and the informal and rural economies. And really, colleagues and friends, we can already see from this very comprehensive pillars that social protection, for it to be effective, would require a systems approach. Next, please. I would just like to read a quote that I lifted directly from the Social Agenda 2063, which demonstrates the importance of following a very comprehensive systems approach. To strengthen a school feeding program, there would be farmers involved producing food. There would be nutrition professionals to advise them on crops required. There would be health workers to reach out to school learners, including for reproductive health services. There will be water and sanitation services prioritized at schools. And in this regard, studies have found out that 34% improvement in education outcomes can be achieved, and 47% improvement in nutrition outcomes, as well as 42% improvement in gender equality outcomes, just to mention a few, when there is a comprehensive and intersectoral approach to provision and implementation of social protection. Next, please. So I would like to, as we move to the next slide, I would like to delve into the AU comprehensive socioeconomic response to the COVID-19 health pandemic and the social protection provisions that it has. As we all know, initially conversations around COVID were focused on health issues, and somehow other equally life-threatening hazards had been neglected, and the African Union Commission came together to prepare a response with guidelines to member states on how they can respond and to protect the vulnerable citizens. So the social agenda became a guide for the development of a core minimum package that countries could use. This response, of course, also builds on the bigger AU agenda, the UN Agenda 23, and the UN resolutions on human security. So the goal of the comprehensive response, as we move to the next slide, is to equalize opportunities and to ensure human security through, among others, social protection and social welfare services, but to also look at the promotion of equality and equity in all sectors. Its social protection pillar tries to provide basic social protection of vulnerable people, but also looking at broader components of social protection provisions like energy, IT, water, and the list as we can see. In terms of the vulnerable groups that are being addressed by social protection are the following. But I would suggest that the list is not comprehensive. To provide social protection, we need to look at these vulnerable groups: migrant workers, migrants, refugees, IDPs, adolescents and youth, older persons, children, etc. But also, on the other hand, provide basic societal services. Now, having talked about the social agenda and the socio-economic response, what other instruments for social protection does the continent have, and their status? Next slide, please. So in terms of legal documents embedding the provision of social protection, we have the protocol, which I've alluded to, of course, already earlier, the protocol to the African Charter on human and people's rights, on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security. This protocol, which has been under development for the last 4 years or so, has received sectoral approval at the ministerial level. It's been subsequently endorsed by the Executive Council and referred to legal specialized technical committee for a final review before bringing it back to the Executive Council in 2021 for approval. But we also have the two protocols that provides protection for older persons and persons with disabilities, adopted respectively in 2016 and 2018. But I would like to highlight, therefore, that these protocols forming the continental structure and provision have not come into force yet. The older persons protocol has actually 3 ratifications. One just came in today, this morning. And the protocol on the rights of persons with disabilities has not been ratified by a single country today. So these are really some of the areas we really need to look at if we need to advance social protection to the groups that have been identified as being more vulnerable. But the instruments protecting them, even though approved at the highest levels, have not come into force. So where do we go from here? Considering that continentally there is goodwill, we have all these policy documents and legal documents, granted that some have yet to be ratified, but the goodwill continentally is there. And I would like to let's move to the next slide, please. I would like to quote from the President of the Republic of Kenya, who said that as a fact of history, a crisis has two elements to it, referring to COVID-19. The first is danger, the second is opportunity. Success is given to the person who exploits the opportunity and evades the danger. And our mindset must be of that of a maker of things. With this in mind, how do we then collectively move from the rhetoric, from the visions, to substantially funding and strengthening social protection institutions in Africa? And for me, this is the core. Evidence has shown that when carefully crafted social protection programs are the best means to achieve good human capital development outcomes. So really, this is a great time for us, looking at what's happening with COVID-19, that we have the socioeconomic response, looking at the social assistance study, and looking at the protocols that we have. This is the time that we must adapt to the current challenges, employ available technology innovatively, and respond to the needs of the population swiftly, in coordination with all stakeholders. And by stakeholders here, as previous speakers alluded to, also including the communities in planning and delivery. So I have a few recommendations here, not in any particular order, to re-examine the continent's fiscal and economic policy priorities. Next slide, please. You need to re-examine the continent's fiscal and economic policy priorities to build stronger health and social sectors. The needs for social protection are interrelated, and if one sector is not tackled, then really, even in Africa, as we say, we need to be inclusive, inspired by the Ubuntu philosophy of you are because I am. Until we relook at the physical and economic policy, then it will just be talk. There's need for increased funding for scale and sustainability. As we've also seen, the case studies presented by the previous speakers are really in between, far and in between. So currently, at least before the COVID-19, only up to 4% of national budgets were being spent on social protection programs. While when we look at vulnerable groups alone, they comprise about 10% of the population. And we need to have studies on return on investment. There are arguments by majority that social assistance funds sometimes are misused and they create laziness. But really, this money is not only plowed back into the local economy, but also helps citizens to start their own enterprises to support their livelihoods. We need to continue with advocacy to ensure finalization and adoption of the social protection protocol, which is currently under review by the legal specialized technical committee, but also collectively to really push for the ratification and domestication of older persons and disability protocols. As I said, disability protocol has not received any, not even a single ratification. And for the older persons protocol, we have 3 ratifications to date. On its part, as a department, the Department of Social Affairs is working with member states to ensure that their responses to COVID-19 are tailored with the special vulnerabilities of children, particularly of girls, but also taking consideration of the fact that majority of the workforce in the informal economy have lost their jobs, and majority will really indeed remain in the informal economy in Africa for a very long time. So to conclude, we need to build on the current positive trends, but applying also the fact that when your brother is sick, you are also sick. So in the spirit of solidarity and common and shared responsibility, if we can build on these positive trends together. The greatest responsibility is with the government, but development assistance can also come in to help governments. Our approach to social protection is that it is not a service that can be delivered to one population or to a group, but it's rather a deliberate choice of governments and communities, a political decision that should be there to assist the poor and the vulnerable. And addressing these challenges require a systematic approach that promotes coherence between programs, policies, and institutions, and which integrate social protection with other sectoral strategies, in particular labor, environment, agriculture, and broadly economic development. So thank you for your attention, and I will wait to take in any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jane. So we have many questions, and we have just 30 minutes for the last comments. So we will proceed that way. We have just a single round, so each panelist will cover different questions, and then we will finish in 30 minutes. But I'd like to announce the next two web seminars that socialprotection.org is organizing. The next one will be 14 July, 2 p.m. GMT. Why are human rights considerations fundamental to social protection response to COVID-19? The other one is 16 July, unbundling the delivery chain, practical examples of linkage between humanitarian cash transfers and social protection from across the globe. So as you can see, it's two important and very complementary in some way what we are debating now in the next two web seminars. So I'd like to, well, I didn't have time to introduce myself. I'm Romulo Paz from Brazil. I'm professor at Fiocruz. And also I'd like to thank Renata Novak, that is somewhere watching this web seminar, because she's in some way the brain behind all this process of producing this report from UNDP report on social assistance in Africa. So we thank Renata for coordinating that initiative. And also all people from IPC that provided technical assistance for promoting this activity. So I'd like to start with Valentina. There are so many questions. I'd like to summarize some of them. One is the comparison between the institutionalization in Asia and Africa. If you could cover that topic, and also if you know in Africa and how you consider an example with all social protection activities are in some way present in the same roof. I mean, a comprehensive social protection institution in Africa, as an example. And also about regularity of cash transfer in rural areas. You know, it's a big challenge because in many cases we don't have that regularity. So how you could observe that in the case of Africa? Or Stephen, can you please also comment about the banking, the process of banking of beneficiaries of cash transfer? Because many of them, they don't have. So how, what kind of strategies is you know in relation to outreach that population that doesn't have bank accounts? Also, if you could comment on the restructuring of social protection budget in South Africa now in as a response to COVID-19 crisis. Also, talking about the corruption in South Africa in relation to the social protection programs. There's many debate about that and how you see that. For Dr. Jane, can you please also cover about this, what necessary data for social protection policy decision? So for policy decision, so how African Union recommending the framework for dealing with that? And also about social protection as a transversal, integrated, and coordinated policy. So what have been the recommendations from African Union about that type of approach for social protection? So Valentina, I'd like to start with you, and all of you will have 8 minutes for this single but very precious considerations.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'll try and speak slower. I was scared into keeping my presentation short, and I might have gone a bit fast. Apologies. So to start with, on the institutionalization in other regions, I confess that I've looked at Latin America a lot from this perspective, and sub-Saharan Africa especially, but also Northern Africa. And I've looked at Asia less, but some broad things that we could be looking at, for example, are well, the distribution of poverty is very different, and that affects just the way in which we're institutionalizing our systems, especially in terms of some of the innovations on the delivery system side. There's in some Asian countries we see sort of a backbone of digitalization, which tends to be stronger in some countries, and including, for example, the ID backbone, which has actually, and civil registration backbone, which has been fundamental in a few of the COVID programs also that we've seen in a few Asian countries. That I mean, sub-Saharan Africa has been catching up very much on that, and Northern Africa is actually kind of leading the way in a few countries, but that's another dimension. And of course also that the capacity at local levels of implementation varies enormously across countries, and it also depends on that historical trajectory. So if you think of some of the ex-Soviet countries, for example, kind of that capacity of local level of implementation is something that has been invested on over the years, and those countries are countries that, for example, do offer fully on-demand, quite inclusive social protection systems, rights-based from that perspective. So I don't feel like I could go beyond that in terms of my comments on that, just off the top of my head. On the second comment of kind of where we've seen countries sort of do a bit more sort of having one single institution in charge, there's been quite a few in recent years which have set kind of one ministry, one entity in charge of the policy setting. Let's think about Zambia, Ghana, for example, and Mozambique. But then also the other countries where we see a strong focus on a single entity for in charge of implementation, and South Africa actually kind of where Stephen has given us an example where SASA is an independent agency that's responsible for driving the implementation of a broad range of grants that work together as a system. Mauritius, but also Mozambique with INASH performing this function. But if you look at those annexes B1 and B2, you can find a lot more details in there. On the rural areas and the challenge of guaranteeing those predictable, regular payments in contexts where, yeah, your traditional means of electronic payments are might not be very effective. There's a lot that has been written on this, and again, I would refer to the paper by Lena Brombach that I circulated within the presentation. But a lot of what the recommendations we're seeing today are around diversifying payments channels, leveraging whatever agents are already in place locally, and kind of enabling those to become payment service providers, working together with post offices where that is relevant and where they have kind of good enough local presence, setting standards in terms of the maximum distance that people should be walking to be able to access their grants. Now with COVID response, we've seen some people actually help to cover the transaction costs in Ghana, sort of paying that transport, what people might be paying in transport to go and collect their grants, having that as a sort of increase in adequacy of transfers. So a lot to be thought about, and one of the links also on the COVID response and payment systems options will be very relevant to you on that if you click on that at the end of this webinar. I wanted to make one last comment myself, sort of not relating to any questions, but just on kind of how existing systems then relate to what can be done in the COVID response, and building on what Stephen has been saying incredibly fast, is that I mean, what we've definitely seen already is countries that have that range of programs working together coherently, as Jane Marie was saying, working coherently as a system, and different programs fulfilling different functions, for example, along the life cycle. So those already had something in place that was a cushion against the response no matter what. Countries where you've got 3%, 1% of population covered in your routine programs, that easy vertical expansion is not going to be doing much in terms of supporting your populations, especially as those who were affected are not your traditional caseloads. We're talking about informal workers, own account workers, people who are part of that famous missing middle. So we need to go beyond that. And when we're talking about new emergency programs or expansions, as Stephen said, we want programs that are not sort of designed last minute during a response. So ideally, the more you're thinking through in advance how you might be responding and preparing for that, and coordinating with your humanitarian counterparts on how you could be leveraging each other's systems to be doing that, you wouldn't go kind of crashing against some of those challenges that, for example, were faced in South Africa. So some countries in Latin America that have been thinking about this more were able to adopt similar strategies to South Africa, but more smoothly. And having said that, if you are designing a program last minute, I mean, considering South Africa actually did a pretty amazing job to try and reach those missing caseloads. It already had quite a strong system, and it leveraged that system. It's leveraged also its interoperability and data sharing agreements with other government counterparts. It made a courageous decision to be supporting people not just as a one-off for 1 month, but for a period of time, and that should be commended as challenging as the challenges were. I'm not taking away any of that. Yeah, so invest in your routine systems because that will pay off, and beat on the iron while it is hot, because now is the chance to do this. Over, and I'll be disappearing at past. Apologies.
Thank you, Valentina. Many thanks. So now I'd like to invite Stephen for your consideration. You have the floor, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Romulo, and thank you for the questions. The first one overlaps a bit with a question that Valentina already answered, which is what to do with people that don't have bank accounts. How do you reach them? I think one of the lessons, maybe two of the lessons from social protection in the last 10 years, the first one, a positive one, is that social protection has often facilitated pro-poor financial inclusion, meaning that poor people get access to bank accounts and therefore to a savings facility, which is very important to protect people against future shocks, whether it's a personal shock like a health issue in your family, or a covariate shock like a massive crisis that we're facing right now with COVID-19. So having access to financial services, through a bank account, which gives you access potentially to savings, loans, also insurance, is really an important byproduct of the recent surge in social protection systems. But the other lesson, I think, which is also quite well exemplified in South Africa, is giving people options. So instead of saying you have to go and queue at a certain office on a certain day to collect your pension, or having to go to a bank to get your money on the first of the month, you can get your SASSA grants, your social grants in South Africa in any number of ways. You can go to shops and use your SASSA card that you're given to cash in the money, or to collect the cash, or to spend the cash at the shop. You get vouchers, you can get mobile money. And so in rural areas in other countries in Africa where you have mobile phone coverage, then mobile money has become a very important way of getting money to people, which doesn't require a bank account. It's just done over the phone. And mobile banks are still used in many places. And of course, the default, if you don't have any of those, is Valentina mentioned post offices as well. If you don't have any of those, then you go to food aid and food transfers. But that's very much seen as an old-fashioned way of doing things. And I think one of the lessons from Botswana is that they still rely very heavily on food transfers, whereas the world has moved on and cash transfers are increasingly preferred everywhere. So moving to cash transfers is not just more efficient, it also gives people more choices, and you can get cash to people in many, many different ways. It doesn't require a bank account necessarily. The next question, I think, was about the South African budget response to COVID-19, and it was actually a massive package that was announced. So after civil society was complaining very loudly at the costs of the lockdown and the fact that the government hadn't responded, except on the health side, for quite a while, there was this huge announcement of a 500 billion rand injection of social relief, which unprecedented. It comes to about 10% of GDP. And that, it wasn't announced formally in Parliament. It was announced by the ruling party, and it's been covered by reallocating existing funds, by using the surplus in the unemployment insurance fund, which is quite large, and by approaching international financial institutions like the World Bank for loans. Of course, one of the issues that many countries are now facing, and South Africa will face it as well, is how are we going to repay all the money that's being spent? Because this fiscal spend it's necessary. It's it's an important response, but it also does raise the question of how and when is it going to be repaid. And here in South Africa, there's a debate going on right now about whether the latest budget and the future budgets that we're going to see in the next couple of years are going to be austerity budgets, when programs will start to be slashed and the social spending will be cut in order to recover this money that's being spent now to deal with the immediate crisis. A related question perhaps is around corruption and the abuse of funds, and whether the institutions that we have are strong enough to protect the social protection beneficiaries against corruption and abuse. And in South Africa, of course, when this announcement was made of 500 billion rand of money being spent through the Solidarity Fund and through various social programs, there was an immediate concern that some of that money could go missing and could be misused. And that's inevitable. It's going to happen for sure. But the question is, are the institutions strong enough to protect most of the money against that kind of abuse? And that's why institutionalization is really so important. And we definitely saw in at least the SASSA food parcels program a real challenge. A lot of the parcels didn't arrive. Many people, most people probably didn't receive the food that they were expecting to get and were entitled to get. And there were reported cases of officials taking those parcels, hiding them, giving them to their relatives. So certainly there was some abuse of those physical food parcels, which comes back exactly to the point that if you have a well-functioning digitized mechanism for transferring resources to poor people, such as a social grant, which is paid electronically through mobile money or bank accounts, that's much less vulnerable to this kind of abuse. Money in a bank account is much less easy to be taken away than a food parcel sitting in a warehouse somewhere. So I think that the lessons here are very strong and very positive. Institutionalization of social assistance, which is happening everywhere across Africa, strengthens not just the delivery of social programs, but also the rights and the entitlements that people are receiving through social programs. So let's move away from food delivered manually towards cash delivered electronically, And let's make sure that's backed up with very strong accountability mechanisms as well, which is an important part of institutionalization. The fact that people have the right and the potential to go and complain if they're not put into a program they should be, and if they don't receive the benefits they're entitled to. I think I'll stop there and hand over to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Please, Dr. Jane, so you have the floor. Your microphone is not on, Dr. Jane.
Is it on now?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Romulo, please, if you could kindly repeat the questions again. I had something about framework for dealing with data and the type of approach for dissemination. If you could just clarify again, please.
Yeah, well, actually, there are many questions addressed to African Union, and some of them include the social protection as integrated policy. So the type of articulation that is necessary for providing integrated and coordinated response. The other one is the kind of data that is necessary for policy-make decisions in terms of social protection. So what I mean has been the recommendations in terms of data provision, and also about what kind of integrated, coordinated policy in terms of the appropriate approach. But also there is other questions that I couldn't cover because they just arrived in relation to the type of articulation that the African Union is doing, including development banks, to respond to COVID-19 crisis. So please feel free to pick the question that you'd like to comment.
Yeah, thank you again, Romulo, and I thank the participants for those questions. In terms of integrated approach for delivery of social protection, again, as I mentioned in the presentation, that it's very cross-cutting, almost cutting across the entire African Union Commission. Firstly, therefore, as I mentioned, we have the specialized technical committees that deal with key aspects of policies in the African Union. The particular one that I work in relates to social development, labor, and employment. But we also have specific sectoral meetings that addresses gender. We have specific ones that that look at economic development. So to say that when such a policy like social protection is developed, implementation cuts across the different departments of the African Union Commission, and each department reports its mandate through the respective specialized technical committee, which then again is scaled up to the heads of states meetings, summits in January. And as I said, that the development are linked to the key continental policies like Social Agenda 2063 and the main Agenda 2063, which have key indicators for reporting and for implementation, where all reporting is done through the AU Special Development Agency, AUDA, or formerly known as NEPAD. So as much as there's compartmentalization, but to a very large extent, AU tries to begin to break these silos by having policies that cuts across the spectrum. In terms of data, I'm not sure how I should respond to this. At the continental level, the policies have been drafted and have been approved. So really the kind of data that's needed is driven at the country level to inform the respective implementation. And as I referred, you recall, I mentioned about various studies on return on investment. This is a really needed with data to be able to support the effectiveness of social protection. Okay, and the other questions that you probably did not mention as I picked from the screen, the relationship between the social protection and the SDGs. When we look at the social agenda, the relationship between social agenda, social protection, and the SDGs, as we looked at the social agenda, it has 9 pillars that correspond to different aspects of the SDGs. The first 2 relate to family and gender equality. And when we look at the other remaining ones that touch on social protection, that touch on access to various services, that touch on, so you begin to see the connectedness in terms of when social agenda is fully implemented and when social protection is fully implemented and applied, it will automatically address various aspects of the social development agendas related to poverty reduction and reducing inequalities. I don't know whether that answers your questions, or I could take more.
Okay.
Hello?
Yes. Have you finished?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to thank you very much to Dr. Jane Marie Ong'olo from African Union, Stephen Devereaux from IDS, and Valentina Barca for sharing the knowledge they accumulated about social protection in Africa, in the case of Stephen, many years, and also about Valentina and Dr. Jean-Marie, very much for sharing with us. I'd also like to thank very much for those who sent questions. Artyom Sichi, Habibu Carbo, Gabriel Fernandez, Mologati Makwela, Jyoti Dingra, and I'd like to apologize for Rubicam, Okruk, Theodore Sass, Cesaltina Abreu, Mihai Mageru, Jacqueline Fries, Messeret Desta, Godfrey Kiama, and Richard Esrum for not being able to cover the topics they mentioned. But we will try to use the platform to address the questions to the panelists and to respond to you. So also, I'll also like to thank Marina, who is in the backstage, organizing all this, the machinery that was necessary for making this session work. So thank you all, and I wish you a good day. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.